So yesterday we saw this triumphal, humble king riding into his capital city of Jerusalem. But what we're going to see today seems like maybe another side to that king. And if you remember in verse 11, he walked into Jerusalem, into the temple, and he saw everything that was going on, but it was getting late, so he decided to leave. So we're going to pick up next day in verse 12. It says, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry, seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves. He went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And in response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. So Jesus and his disciples are walking from Bethany back to Jerusalem because apparently that's where they stayed the night. And I'm assuming they stayed with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus because that's where they're from. But on their way, Jesus gets hungry and he sees this fig tree that's afar off and he goes up to it to see if there's anything on it. But the only thing that he finds is leaves. And so he did the only thing that a good person would do. He curses the fig tree. Now, I'll be honest, when I read this story, I think, well, that doesn't look good for Jesus. Even the way that Mark writes it makes it sound like he just lost his temper with the fig tree. Even Mark adds that it was not the season for figs. So what really is going on here? And I think we got to look at the context to understand, because later on we'll come back to the fig tree, but in the middle, with this fig tree sandwich, in the middle we see Jesus going into the temple. So we'll gather some understanding as we look at verse 15. So they came to Jerusalem, and then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the table of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and saw how that they might destroy him, for they feared him, because of all the people were astonished by him. And when evening had come, he went out of the city. So Jesus goes into the temple, probably the outer part, the Gentile court. And he sees people buying and selling and exchanging money and selling doves. And just kind of this one-stop shop for worshipers. And it's just business as usual until Jesus comes and he starts turning over tables and running everybody out. You can imagine people running and screaming and the animals making their noise when they get spooked and being ran out, and then the tables being turned over and the coins going everywhere. It's just chaotic and violent, and it was turmoil. And Jesus was mad. I mean, it was like he had flipped his lid. And it seems really out of character for him, because he's always so calm, cool, and collected. You know, dealing with the 12 disciples and the problems that they have, or dealing with the Pharisees and being confronted by his enemies. And so I don't think, though, he lost his temper here. Remember back in verse 11, he had already entered into the temple, saw everything that was going on, and he left because it was late. But I think this was a calculated thing by Jesus. And if you remember, this was his Father's house. This was a house of prayer. They had turned something that was supposed to be spiritual into something like a stockyard. And so let's continue on in verse 20. I think we'll see the lesson. It says, "Now in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away.'" I really think Jesus was using this fig tree as a living illustration for us to show us what these people in the temple were really like on the inside. That on the outside, they had this appearance of life. There was lots of activity. There was lots of leaves. But on the inside, they were rotten. They're really dead. And Jesus was going to pronounce judgment upon them. And the same thing that happened to this fig tree was going to happen to Jerusalem, and it would 70 years later. But isn't it incredible? A challenging lesson for us to realize that just because we try to offer something to God doesn't mean that he's going to accept it. We need to make sure we're offering God what he really wants, and that we can't just exchange things that are supposed to be spiritual for things that are physical. Lots of challenging lessons.